Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, NBC News Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, and New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker. Mike, I'm going to start with you. How is the Biden team trying to look at these rallies that Donald Trump is holding? Having a rally in the Bronx, did that shake anything within the Biden team about their approach?
Well, the Biden team is not necessarily worried about Donald Trump's campaign tactics. The rallies are a staple of what he's been up to. I think they are very concerned about the fact that he has been dominating the media landscape for as long as this trial has been going on. I was talking earlier this week with a senior campaign official about the impact the trial has had, and they actually held their hands out like they were handcuffed to say that the campaign has been handcuffed by the inability really to get their message out as long as this trial has been dominating the media attention. And so that's why you're seeing this potentially new approach once the trial wraps up, regardless of the verdict, guilty or not guilty, for the campaign to come out swinging hard. If Trump is convicted, they are considering branding him not a former president, but convicted felon for the rest of the campaign. If he is acquitted, they're also looking at a similar situation to what they found 4 years ago when candidate Joe Biden was struggling to gain traction ahead of the Iowa caucus's New Hampshire primary because of Trump's impeachment trial. In those closing days before Iowa, it was then candidate Biden saying the die is cast here. Trump will be acquitted, and so therefore the onus is on me to beat him in November. That's going to be the argument if indeed Trump is acquitted, because the Biden campaign thinks that the biggest problem that this trial has posed is it's increased the doubts among those least engaged voters who still, for whatever reason, don't believe Trump will be the Republican nominee. Once the trial is over and once they're on a debate stage in just a few weeks, that will crystallize the Biden's campaign's view. That will crystallize the choice that the voters face. Whether you like that these are the candidates or not, it is Donald Trump versus Joe Biden.
Do they feel like they're able to get their message out on the economy?
Well, that is certainly what every poll across every age group shows is the dominant issue for voters. And that's what the Biden campaign wants to be doing more of, is, yes, to have the president showing that characteristic empathy, saying he understands that voters are feeling the pain, that he's doing everything he can, and that you've heard him in some of these events he's been doing, maybe with not as much attention, trying to crystallize this as a choice of Joe Biden, who views the economy through the lens of Scranton, his middle-class upbringing, versus Donald Trump, who is only on the side of the wealthy and those campaign donors. That's the choice they want to get out in front of voters, but they've been having a hard time doing it.
Yamiche, talk to me about the latest in the Double Haters series that we've been doing. What have you found?
Well, it's been really interesting, and for people who, of course, are starting to get familiar with this term, double haters, it's the people who don't like former President Trump, but also don't really like President Biden either. And we had a focus group of Latino double haters who were living in Arizona, and they told us that they were really worried about the economy, which is, of course, one of the top issues, but also about the border. They didn't like the handling of both. So take a listen to what they told us.
I feel like they both contributed into not having Washington have any sort of deal in regards to immigration. I feel they both played a part.
It's like you don't hear him speak about the border or try to push for any change or policies in the border, and that's all you would hear about Trump, even though all he would talk about is a wall, but at least he would, that's something.
It just keeps denying that there's anything wrong with the border. Just keeps saying that there's being taken care of, is being taken care of.
It just relates back to, I don't think Biden's done much of anything. I mean, Trump was very aggressive with immigration, and I feel like Biden let it just unravel.
And really what we heard from people are that they do think that former President Donald Trump would do a better job with the border, but they also blamed him for border legislation not going through Congress. They acknowledged, one voter especially, acknowledged that there was a deal on the border and that it was Donald Trump who said that he did not want to support that and take the bill. So that voter said, well, he kind of wants this to be a live issue because it helps him. So really interesting things that we heard from these voters, Katie.
Peter, I want to kind of broaden out for you on this, or not kind of, I do want to broaden out for you on this. I came across a David Brooks article from a year ago asking the question, what if we're the bad guys here? Talking about the way that these issues are framed, Donald Trump and a threat to democracy and abortion. And of course, why would you ever consider voting for him? That there is something that the people who see that are missing. And he writes this. The ideal that we're all in this together was replaced with the reality that the educated class lives in a world up here and everybody else is forced into a world down there. Members of our class are always publicly speaking out for the marginalized, but somehow we always end up building systems that serve ourselves. I was struck by last night in the Bronx, one of the things that came up among the voters there was that the migrants were a problem, and they were taking away services from people in this city who needed the services. And I think that that's a really good example of what David Brooks is arguing here, which is that you have the meritocracy up here, the people who have achieved and earned and are, in a cycle of self-fulfillment. And then you have everybody else who are fighting for the scraps down here. And if you're looking for somebody to help you portray that anger, Donald Trump has successfully been able to convince you he is that person.
Yeah, no, he is. The irony, of course, is a New York billionaire, but somehow he has framed himself as a populist champion of destroying the status quo. And whatever the status quo that you don't like is, you can look at him as your warrior, in effect. And that could be a cultural warrior kind of status quo. It could be an economic status quo. It could be immigration, race, religion, values, all of these different things that some people feel are, out of whack in America. He is embodying, in their view, the sledgehammer to the establishment. And the establishment, of course, has worked well for those who are doing well. And so they're not looking at Trump that way. They look at him as an agent of chaos and destruction, somebody who's tearing down systems and institutions that have worked, at least for those parts of America, for many, many years. And I think that's the dichotomy we're at here. It's not, in some ways, obviously, it's an election about Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but it's also an election about America. And that's about where Americans are at this point and how they feel about their country.
Yeah, and to be fair, most Americans aren't happy with either candidate. They don't want either candidate to be running. They don't feel like this election is representative of what they want, but this is the election they have. I wonder, do you think the Biden team is on top of this? Are they missing something here? Is their messaging that Donald Trump's a threat to democracy, Donald Trump's a threat to women, compelling enough voters for them to beat him? And I asked that because I had David Wasserman on yesterday of the Cook Political Report, and they just had a survey that said, yeah, a lot of voters, the majority of them, realize that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, and I think that he might want to become a dictator, and that he is a threat to women's health, but they worry about their pockets more, their economic outlook, and not that they're doing well now, but that they might not still be doing well in the future. There's a feeling of insecurity looking beyond today into tomorrow and the next week, next year, and they think that Donald Trump is the one who's going to be better able to protect them economically.
Yeah, and there's a disconnect, obviously, between statistics and perception at this point, right? We saw polling just this week, I think, that showed that, half the country, maybe even a majority of the country, believe that we're in a recession. Well, we are just statistically not in a recession. That's just a factual statement. Many Americans believe that, that the stock market is down, when in fact, of course, it is up. Many people believe that unemployment is at a 50-year high, when in fact, actually, it has been the lowest it has been in 50 years in terms of a streak under 4%. So, there is a perception out there that things aren't going well among a lot of people, even if the statistics are telling them otherwise. And the Biden campaign's challenge has been trying to communicate a message to the contrary, and it hasn't worked, right? We saw that last year with months of Bidenomics. That was the phrase that they tried to market for a while. It didn't work. And people don't want to be told the economy is good if they don't feel that way. So how does the Biden campaign get through? They're stuck in this very awkward position. Their hope had been that as the economy continued to do well heading into the fall, that eventually people would see it in their own lives in a way that gave them faith and confidence in where things are going. But that doesn't seem to be happening at this point. And we're very close to the point where people start casting ballots and perceptions are locking in.
Listen, Joe Biden won partly because Donald Trump was doing such a terrible job with the pandemic. But now that the pandemic has passed, it does seem, Peter, that there is a pandemic hangover. There's pandemic PTSD that this country is going through and hasn't quite figured out yet. And I wonder now if Joe Biden is the one that is suffering from that pandemic hangover, this feeling, this lack of optimism that Americans have, that optimism that seemed to be stripped away because of what happened to us during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a period of what we would call in the Jimmy Carter era, kind of a malaise on some level. A lot of Americans still feel very upset at the pandemic, or as you say, kind of not excited or not enthusiastic. There's still a lot of feeling that the schools let kids down, and that the kids are now still trying to catch up. There's a sense that the economy hasn't fully recovered, even though by most statistical measures it really has. It's doing quite well, certainly better than other large economies around the world. But that perception hasn't caught up. And look, this is a sour period in our history more generally. If you look at the poll numbers, it will show you that most Americans have believed that the United States is on the wrong track now. Going back to the Bush era, about halfway through George W. Bush's presidency, the number of Americans who thought we were on the wrong track fell below 50%, and it hasn't gone above that since then. It's basically been a prolonged period of disenchantment and disillusionment, and that's played havoc in our politics, and it can be played out in different ways: outsiders versus insiders, establishment versus disruption agents. But basically, we are in a period in our history that the pandemic has only accentuated, where we don't really believe in the country the same way we used to.